On the morning of July 24, 1943, the American submarine USS Tanosa found herself in a position that every submarine commander dreamed of. Her target was the Tonan Maru No. 3, a 19,000-ton whale factory ship converted to an oil tanker, one of the largest vessels in the Japanese merchant fleet. She was alone, unescorted, lumbering across the Pacific toward the home islands, with her holds full of petroleum that Japan desperately needed. Commander Dudley Morton's Wahoo had made this kind of attack famous, a single submarine against a single massive target, a chance to inflict catastrophic damage on the enemy's logistics with a single spread of torpedoes. Tanosa's commander, Lieutenant Commander Daspit, maneuvered into perfect firing position and gave the order to fire. The first two torpedoes struck home, their explosions sending columns of water skyward and stopping the tanker dead in the water. Tonan Maru was mortally wounded, listing heavily, clearly unable to escape. But she was not sinking quickly, and Daspit wanted to make certain of his kill. He circled the stricken ship, selected a new firing angle, and launched another torpedo. It ran true, struck the tanker's hull squarely, and failed to explode. He fired again, another dud, again, another dud. Over the next hour, Daspit fired 11 more torpedoes at a stationary target from point-blank range. Every single one hit. Not one of them detonated. Daspit faced an impossible choice. He had 2 torpedoes remaining, and experience suggested they would fail like all the others. He could fire them and complete his attack, or he could save them as evidence of the catastrophe that was crippling the American submarine force. He chose evidence. Tanosa returned to Pearl Harbor with 2 unexploded Mark 14 torpedoes in her tubes and a commander whose fury was barely contained. The Tonan Maru, despite absorbing 15 torpedo hits, was eventually towed to port and repaired. She would survive the war. The career of the Mark 14 torpedo, however, was finally approaching its end. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is one of the most shameful episodes in American naval history. For 21 months, from the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the final corrections in September 1943, American submarines went to war with weapons that did not work. Commanders risked their lives to reach firing positions. Crews endured depth charge attacks to escape after launching their weapons. And time after time, the torpedoes they fired either missed their targets, failed to explode on impact, or detonated prematurely before reaching them. The cost in lives, in ships that should have been sunk, in a war that was extended by logistical failures, is incalculable, and the responsibility for this disaster lay squarely with the Bureau of Ordnance, the naval bureaucracy that designed, tested, and produced the weapons, and that refused for nearly 2 years to acknowledge that anything was wrong. To understand how this happened, one must understand the culture of the peacetime Navy and the institutional dynamics that allowed a flawed weapon to enter service and remain in service despite overwhelming evidence of its failures. The Mark 14 torpedo was developed during the 1930s, a period of severe budget constraints and limited opportunities for realistic testing. The weapon incorporated 2 significant innovations: a magnetic influence exploder, designated the Mark 6, and an improved contact exploder. Both were designed in secrecy so extreme that even the submarine commanders who would use them in combat were given only minimal information about how they worked. The magnetic exploder was an elegant concept with a fatal implementation. The idea was that a torpedo passing beneath a ship would detect the distortion in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the vessel's steel hull. This detection would trigger detonation directly under the keel, where the explosion would break the ship's back rather than merely punching a hole in its side. A magnetic explosion could sink a target with a single hit. A contact explosion might require several. The potential advantage was significant enough that the Germans, British, and Japanese all developed similar systems. The problem was that the Mark VI exploder had never been adequately tested under realistic conditions. Peacetime testing of the Mark XIV had been constrained by budget limitations that seem almost incomprehensible in retrospect. Torpedoes were expensive, approximately $10,000 each in 1941 currency, equivalent to nearly $200,000 today. The Bureau of Ordnance could not afford to expend large numbers of live weapons in testing, so most trials were conducted with exercise heads that lacked explosives. These dummy torpedoes could verify that the weapon ran at the correct depth, followed the correct course, and activated its exploder mechanism at the appropriate moment. What they could not verify was whether the exploder would actually detonate a warhead under combat conditions. The magnetic exploder, in particular, was tested under conditions that bore little resemblance to the Pacific theater, where it would be employed. The Earth's magnetic field varies significantly by latitude, with different characteristics in the temperate waters around Newport, Rhode Island, where most testing occurred, and the tropical waters around the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, where the war would be fought. The Mark VI was calibrated for North Atlantic conditions and never recalibrated for the Pacific. When submarines began firing torpedoes at Japanese ships in the waters around the Philippines, the magnetic exploders began behaving erratically, detonating prematurely, failing to detect targets, or triggering at depths that caused the explosion to occur too far from the hull to inflict significant damage. The contact exploder had its own problems, though these would not become fully apparent until later in the crisis. The mechanism used a firing pin that was driven into a detonator by the impact of the torpedo against a ship's hull. The design worked adequately in glancing impacts, where the torpedo struck at an angle and the firing pin had time to build momentum. But in the perpendicular impacts that occurred when a torpedo hit squarely, exactly the shot that submarine commanders trained for, the pin experienced forces that exceeded its structural strength. It crumpled before it could reach the detonator. The perfect shot produced a dud. Compounding these exploder problems was a third defect, perhaps the most inexcusable of all. The torpedoes ran approximately 4 feet deeper than set. This meant that a torpedo aimed at a ship's waterline would pass beneath the keel, while a torpedo set to run shallow enough to hit the hull would sometimes broach the surface and miss entirely. The depth-keeping mechanism had been designed using a pendulum system that worked correctly in static testing, but failed under the dynamic conditions of an actual torpedo run. The Bureau of Ordnance knew about this tendency toward deep running before the war, but considered the deviation acceptable. They did not inform submarine commanders of the issue. When the war began and submarines started returning from patrol with reports of torpedo failures, the Bureau of Ordnance responded with denial and deflection. The problems, Bureau officials insisted, lay not with the torpedoes, but with the crews who fired them. Submarine commanders were accused of poor shooting, of overestimating their successes, of making alibis for attacks that had simply missed. The Bureau's confidence in its own testing protocols was unshakable. If the torpedoes worked in Newport, they must work in the Pacific. Any evidence to the contrary was dismissed as operator error. This institutional arrogance was reinforced by the Navy's hierarchical culture. Submarine commanders were relatively junior officers, typically lieutenant commanders or commanders. The bureau chiefs who dismissed their reports were admirals and captains with decades of service and unimpeachable credentials. Challenging the bureau's findings required challenging the competence of senior officers whose careers had been built on torpedo development. Few commanders were willing to take that risk, and those who did found their complaints buried in bureaucratic procedures designed to protect the institution from external criticism. The cost of this dysfunction was paid in blood. Submarine after submarine returned from patrol with stories of attacks that should have succeeded, but didn't. Commander Tyrrell Jacobs of the USS Sargo fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese freighter in December 1941 and achieved no hits despite ideal firing conditions. Commander William Wright of the USS Sturgeon fired 4 torpedoes at a tanker in February 1942, heard what he believed were detonations, and claimed the ship sunk, only to learn later that the target had survived with minor damage. Commander Chester Smith of the USS Swordfish fired 12 torpedoes during a single patrol and achieved only 1 confirmed sinking. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. The human toll extended beyond the immediate consequences of failed attacks. Submarines that missed their targets often faced counterattacks by escort vessels that would otherwise have been distracted by a sinking ship. Depth charges killed crews whose torpedoes should have eliminated the threat before it materialized. Commanders who survived these attacks carried psychological burdens that compounded the physical dangers of submarine service. The knowledge that your weapon might not work, that you might do everything right and still fail, still die, still watch your crew die, created a strain that peacetime training had never contemplated. The crisis began to break in early 1943, when Admiral Charles Lockwood assumed command of Pacific submarine operations. Lockwood was a career submarine officer who had commanded boats himself and understood the realities of combat in ways that desk-bound ordnance experts did not. He arrived at Pearl Harbor determined to increase the effectiveness of his force, and he quickly identified torpedo reliability as the central obstacle to success. Unlike his predecessors, Lockwood was willing to challenge the Bureau of Ordnance directly, marshalling evidence and demanding accountability. Lockwood's first target was the deep-running problem. He ordered a series of tests using a fishing net suspended at a known depth, through which torpedoes were fired with exercise heads. The results were unambiguous. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were passing through the net at 14 feet or deeper. The Bureau of Ordnance, confronted with this evidence, finally acknowledged the depth-keeping defect and issued instructions for submarine commanders to set their torpedoes 4 feet shallower than intended. It was a fix, though not a cure. The underlying mechanical problem would not be resolved until new torpedoes entered production months later. The magnetic exploder was next. Lockwood had suspected problems with the Mark VI from the beginning of his command, and patrol reports confirmed his suspicions. Torpedoes were detonating prematurely, their explosions occurring hundreds of yards short of targets. Others were passing beneath ships without triggering at all. The performance was so erratic that commanders could not predict what would happen when they fired. After months of lobbying, Lockwood received permission to deactivate the magnetic exploders entirely, relying instead on contact detonation. He issued the order in June 1943, expecting that the contact exploder would finally give his submarines reliable weapons. He was wrong. The Tanosa incident in July 1943 exposed the contact exploder's fatal flaw. Daspit's 11 consecutive duds against a stationary target could not be explained by poor shooting or magnetic interference. Something was fundamentally wrong with the weapon's ability to detonate on impact. Lockwood now faced the most difficult phase of the crisis, convincing the Bureau of Ordnance that its contact exploder, the backup system that was supposed to work when everything else failed, was also defective. The Bureau's resistance to this conclusion was, if anything, more intense than its earlier denials. The magnetic exploder was a new technology, sophisticated and perhaps temperamental. The contact exploder was a simple mechanical device, a firing pin hitting a detonator on impact. Bureau engineers could not conceive of how such a basic mechanism could fail. They accused Lockwood's commanders of continued incompetence. suggesting that the torpedoes were hitting at angles too shallow to activate the exploder. The possibility that the exploder itself was flawed was rejected without serious investigation. Lockwood, increasingly desperate, authorized his own testing program at Pearl Harbor. Torpedoes with exercise heads were fired at underwater cliffs, recovered by divers, and examined for evidence of exploder activation. The results revealed the crumpling firing pin problem, proving that perpendicular impacts, exactly the kind of hit that submarine commanders sought, produced mechanical failures rather than detonations. Lockwood presented this evidence to the Bureau and demanded immediate corrective action. The Bureau, its credibility now thoroughly damaged, finally agreed to redesign the firing pin. The modification was relatively simple, a lighter pin that moved faster and resisted the deformation that caused duds, and it entered the fleet in September 1943. 21 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. 21 months of submarines going to war with weapons that did not work. 21 months of attacks that failed, of ships that escaped, of crews that died because their torpedoes could not protect them. 21 months of bureaucratic denial, institutional arrogance, and willful blindness to evidence that challenged official assumptions. The Mark 14 torpedo scandal was not a failure of technology alone. It was a failure of culture, of leadership, of the peacetime habits that the Navy had carried into war without recognizing their costs. The consequences of the torpedo crisis extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Every ship that escaped destruction in 1942 and early 1943 continued to carry cargo that sustained the Japanese war effort. Oil tankers that should have been sunk delivered fuel to Japanese aircraft and warships. Troop transports that should have been destroyed delivered soldiers to reinforce garrisons that American forces would later have to assault. The merchant shipping that survived the early submarine campaign represented a strategic reserve that Japan could draw upon when losses began to mount in 1944. The war was longer and bloodier because the torpedoes did not work. The human stories from this period are difficult to read without anger. Commander Howard Gilmore of the USS Growler was killed in February 1943 after a surface engagement with a Japanese patrol boat. His submarine had been attacking a convoy earlier in the patrol, firing torpedoes that failed to explode. If those torpedoes had worked, Growler might not have been in the position that led to the fatal encounter. Gilmore's last order, "Take her down," became famous as an example of heroic self-sacrifice. But the sacrifice should not have been necessary. He died because his weapons failed him. Commander John Cromwell, aboard the USS Sculpin, chose to go down with his submarine in November 1943, rather than risk capture and the exposure of intelligence he carried. Sculpin had been damaged by depth charges after an attack that achieved no hits despite good firing solutions. If the torpedoes had worked, if the target had been sinking instead of calling for assistance, Sculpin might have escaped. Cromwell was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his decision. The torpedo crisis ensured that decision was necessary. The fix, when it finally came, transformed the submarine campaign almost overnight. Sinkings increased dramatically in the last months of 1943 and continued to rise throughout 1944. Commanders who had spent months fighting weapons that betrayed them now had torpedoes they could trust. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical improvement. Crews that had approached each attack with fatalistic uncertainty now expected their weapons to work. Confidence replaced doubt, aggression replaced caution, and the results were visible in the mounting toll of Japanese shipping losses. The Bureau of Ordnance emerged from the scandal with its reputation damaged, but its institutional structure intact. No senior officers were relieved or disciplined for the failures that had extended the war and cost lives. The official history of the torpedo crisis, written after the war, presented the problems as technical challenges that were eventually overcome through diligent engineering effort. The role of bureaucratic obstruction in delaying solutions was minimized. The deaths that resulted from that obstruction were not discussed. This institutional self-protection would have consequences extending beyond the immediate war years. The culture that had produced the Torpedo Scandal, the dismissal of operational feedback, the protection of established programs from criticism, the prioritization of institutional reputation over battlefield effectiveness would recur in subsequent decades. The problems with the Mark 46 torpedo in Vietnam, the issues with the Patriot missile system in the Gulf War, the continuing challenges of defense acquisition reform all echo the patterns established in 1941 through 1943. The Navy learned tactical lessons from the torpedo crisis, but failed to learn the institutional lessons that might have prevented similar failures in the future. For the submarine commanders who had fought through the crisis, the memories remain sharp decades later. In interviews conducted after the war, veterans spoke of the frustration and rage they had felt watching their torpedoes fail, knowing they were risking their lives for attacks that could not succeed. They spoke of the contempt they developed for the bureaucrats who dismissed their reports, who accused them of incompetence rather than acknowledging defects in their own products. They spoke of shipmates who died in attacks that should have worked, whose sacrifices were wasted by weapons that failed. The anger, even 50 years later, was palpable. The Mark 14 torpedo, once its defects were corrected, became an effective weapon that contributed significantly to Japan's defeat. By the war's end, American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, a campaign that strangled the island nation's economy and crippled its war-making capacity. The torpedoes that accomplished this destruction were the same Mark 14s that had failed so catastrophically in the early war years. Same design, same production facilities, same everything except the modifications that Lockwood had fought so hard to obtain. The difference between catastrophic failure and overwhelming success was a few inches in depth setting, a deactivated magnetic exploder, and a redesigned firing pin. The solutions were simple. The path to implementing them was not. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the torpedo scandal is how easily it could have been prevented. Realistic testing during the development phase would have revealed the depth-keeping problem. Trials using live warheads against actual targets would have exposed the exploder defects. Consultation with submarine commanders about operational requirements might have shaped a weapon better suited to combat conditions. None of these steps were taken because the Bureau of Ordnance believed they were unnecessary, because budget constraints made live-fire testing expensive, because peacetime institutional culture prioritized economy and secrecy over effectiveness and accountability. The war provided a harsh education. By September 1943, the Navy understood that weapons must be tested under realistic conditions, that operational feedback must be taken seriously, that institutional pride must yield to evidence of failure. These lessons were learned, or at least acknowledged, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. Whether they were truly internalized, whether they shaped the culture of weapons development in subsequent decades, is a question that each generation of military leaders must answer anew. The submarines of the Pacific Fleet went on to achieve one of the most lopsided victories in naval history, sinking a Japanese merchant marine that could not be replaced and helping to bring about the collapse of the empire. This victory was delayed by 21 months of fighting with broken weapons. 21 months in which every attack was a gamble, not just against the enemy, but against the likelihood that the torpedo would work as designed. The commanders and crews who persevered through this period deserve better from the institution they served. They received failure, denial, and finally, grudging correction. Their eventual success was achieved not because of the Bureau of Ordnance, but despite it. The Mark 14 torpedo scandal remains relevant because the dynamics that produced it remain present in military institutions worldwide. The tendency to trust testing over operational feedback, to protect programs from criticism, to dismiss field reports that contradict official assessments. These patterns are endemic to large bureaucratic organizations. The scandal is a reminder that technology alone does not win wars, that weapons must work in combat rather than merely in controlled tests, that the gap between laboratory performance and battlefield reality can be measured in lives. It is a reminder that institutions must be structured to hear unwelcome truths, that feedback mechanisms must be robust enough to overcome hierarchical resistance, that the price of bureaucratic self-protection is paid by the people at the sharp end. 21 months, thousands of torpedoes fired, hundreds of ships that should have been sunk, dozens of submarines lost, some of them because their attacks failed and they could not escape the counterattacks that followed. The torpedo scandal was a preventable disaster, a failure of peacetime preparation that extended into wartime crisis, a monument to institutional dysfunction that cost lives and prolonged a war. The submarines that won the Pacific campaign did so after overcoming not only the Japanese enemy, but also the failures of their own navy. Their victory was real, their sacrifice genuine, their contribution to defeating Japan immeasurable. But they deserved weapons that worked from the beginning. They did not receive them. That failure should never be forgotten.